To me, the spiritual journey has been a process of self-awareness and self-understanding. And I think that rings true for a lot of people. But what I think is difficult to understand is how to actually start that process. And for a long time, I thought I had started the process. I had been reading a lot, and I felt like I understood myself. And I think a lot of people feel like they do understand themselves. I mean, if I asked you, what kind of person you are, what you like, what you don't like, what makes you angry, what doesn't make you angry, what makes you happy or sad, I think you could probably answer that question. But I think self-awareness goes beyond that into sort of a more direct perception of what we are. That is all the content of the self, of our ego. And I think a lot of us feel like we are aware of that, but the question is, how are we aware of that? So there's direct perception, directly aware of a desire or a fear, and then there's more of an indirect perception. Now that indirect perception kind of happens after the fact. And I think that's where most people are. And I think that's why we're not really truly self-aware. So how does that happen? So you have something. Something arises in you, some reaction to something. Let's say you have a fear of losing your job, okay? Now, how aware are you really of that fear? Now, most people will actually have the fear and then respond to that fear in some way. So how might you respond to that fear? You might say, I shouldn't be scared. You might say, I need to control that fear. You might say, why am I afraid? You might say, I want to understand fear. So there are all these motivations that go along with how to sort of handle the fear. And I like to use the word address. So we have a fear. And then what we do is address that fear in some way internally. And so what you've gotten is your first reaction, and then you've gotten a reaction to the reaction. And to me, that is not a minor point. To me, that is the way in to becoming self-aware. After all, if you're scared of something, and then you're jumping next into thinking about that fear in some way, shape, or form, addressing that fear in some way, shape, or form, you're no longer paying attention to the fear. And if the true path to spirituality lies in awareness of all the activity of the self, how can we be aware of the self when we're already moving on to the next thing? And so, in that way, to me, the self is really not just one activity. It's actually a chain reaction of activities. And so I think that's really important to discover. And I think that if you discover that, that really unlocks your entire inner universe. So how can we discover that? Well, if we're saying that we're scared of something, and we're saying that we're responding to that fear, say by analyzing the fear, how can we become aware of the fear? Can we try to become aware of the fear? No, that would be another way of addressing our fear. Can we use a method to try to decrease our level of fear, like meditation, for example? That, yet again, would be a response to the fear. So to me, what was important in the beginning was not becoming aware of the fear that I had, but rather becoming aware of the response I had to that fear. And in that way, you're sort of more at the periphery of things, a periphery of your thought process. And I think that's fine because that's actually where most of us live, I believe. We are sort of at the very surface of an underbelly of activity within us that we're not fully aware of. And so the key is to have insight into that response to yourself, in my view. And how that's done is murky. How that's done is challenging because every how that we use to try to become aware is another effort of the activity of the self. And so, as opposed to making yet another activity and being even farther away from the seminal event, we need to figure out a way to not do anything as we recognize these things. And, one of my old yoga instructors, when I started talking about this type of spiritual path, she did the following with her hands. That's the process. This is the process of becoming self-aware. So instead of this hand trying to understand that hand, it's a movement backwards. And so in my last video, I talked a lot about how to try to de-emphasize thinking. Because really, in the end, we have to understand deeply that thinking will not help us to become self-aware. In fact, thinking is the opposite. It just draws us farther and farther away. So has that happened for you? Have you realized something about yourself? Have you realized something about yourself that shows you how you respond to yourself? That's the big question. Self-realization, or realizing things about yourself, is unmistakable. It's not an endless amount of thinking. There's no work involved. There's no effort involved. It is just understanding. Understanding without words. Understanding immediately. And so I liken it to, for example, you're walking out to your car and all of a sudden you're looking for your keys and your keys aren't there. And all of a sudden you realize you forgot your keys. Especially in the early stages, when you begin to realize things about how your mind works, that's how it feels. It's shocking. It should be a shock to you when you actually see something about yourself. And it's shocking because you're actually seeing it. And once you actually see something about yourself, you realize you never really were aware of these things. You learned about these things. You had ideas about these things, but you were never really aware of anything about yourself. The only way that you can become aware of anything within yourself is passively. A passive, wordless, thoughtless awareness. And so that's where, in my mind, the notion of decreasing the value of thought comes in. You have to disbelieve that thinking is going to give you that degree of clear awareness. So in addition to that, I would say that when the self responds to itself by all the various means we talked about, I think what's equally shocking is when you can see that from the beginning. So if you can see how your thinking is responding to itself, you've really unlocked a lot. You've really seen how really on the inside, in certain ways and in certain instances, we're in conflict with ourselves. And people talk about inner conflict all the time. Now, I wouldn't use the word personally inner conflict because let's say there's some issue that you have within yourself and you want to justify that with the self. So in a way, that second thought process that comes along is not necessarily in conflict. It's a vote of confidence. It can be a vote of confidence in the way you address your problems. I should have been angry. He was in the wrong, for example. So considering that, considering how awareness trumps thinking, and trying to look into yourself, or not trying, but seeing if you can come across this in some way, shape, or form. I can tell you it might feel like an accident. It might feel it's not something that you can effort to do. But you can consider this, you can think about it, and you can talk about it, and you can write about it. You can make YouTube videos about it. But the actual occurrence is beyond any effort that you may attempt. But that's the beginning. And that's why it's so difficult to explain how to do that, because there's no how. There's no way you can try to do that. To develop that ability to be aware of yourself, that's the key. That's the start. That's the start of everything